The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the January National Farm to School Network Farm to Early Care and Education quarterly webinar. Today's webinar is Placing Equity at the Center of Farm to Early Care and Education. Before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders for you. This webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing on the National Farm to School Network resource database. You'll also receive a link to that recording in the follow-up email, as well as resources and any reports and information shared by our presenters today in that follow-up email. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. As questions come up for you, we would welcome questions and we'll have plenty of time for question and answers at the end of the session today. Please enter those questions into the question box on your control panel, and we'll have time to discuss those at the end of the session. Our Farm to Early Care and Education webinars do occur on a quarterly basis, so please mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will take place in April, on April 10th. Again, you'll receive a link to that registration in the follow-up email. My name is Lacey Stevens, and I'm the Program Manager with the National Farm to School Network. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to some additional learning opportunities from the National Farm to School Network. Coming up, we have some other exciting webinars that we'd love for you to join us. Next week on Thursday, we have the National Farm to School Network Policy webinar. In February, we have our February Trending Topics webinar focused on food waste. And as I mentioned, in April, we'll continue our Farm to Early Care and Education quarterly webinar series on April 10th. I'd also like to invite you to our upcoming National Farm to Cafeteria Conference taking place in April in Cincinnati, Ohio. This biennial event will convene more than 1,000 diverse stakeholders working to source local food for institutions and cafeterias across the country and to foster a culture of food and agricultural literacy across America. This is the premier networking and learning event that will help you take your farm to early care and education work to the next level. We're actually now accepting scholarship applications at farmtoschool.org/conference. And because farm to early care and education is a priority for the National Farm to School Network, early care and education providers will be prioritized for conference scholarships. So please check this out and plan to join us in Cincinnati in April. We are incredibly lucky to have a fantastic lineup of speakers with us to discuss racial equity in farm to early care and education. We'll be getting started with some introductions and sharing some definitions so we can have some shared language around both racial equity and farm to early care and education as a platform for our discussion today. Then we'll hear from three leaders in the field. We'll start with Jeffrey Capizano from the Policy Equity Group, who will introduce us to racial and social equity as both a lens and an outcome, and help break down some policy pieces from an equity perspective. We hear from James Kuel, who will then share with us, Jamise Kuel, who will then share with us the Food Trust journey in developing an equity framework as a core of their farm to early care and education work. Finally, Tess Draves from the Center for Environmental Farming Systems will help us understand the historical and structural racism within the food system that contributes to our current inequities, and share with us the North Carolina Farm to ECE Initiative's approach to advancing racial equity. So let's get started. We've got a lot of great content and great speakers to hear from today. The National Farm to School Network has established racial and social equity as an organizational priority, and in the next week, we'll be issuing a statement about our organizational journey to place equity at the center of our work. In our practice and in our journey, we've been hugely inspired and learned immense amounts from the work of our guest speakers and their organizations. So our goals today really center around our audience and our speakers to share in the benefits of those learnings and those journeys from these organizations and those speakers, and to also really start a dialogue within the farm to early care and education community, and hopefully equip all of you with some tools and conversations points to bring up these conversations and start these talking points within your own organizations. So let's start with some shared definitions to develop some shared language as a starting point for our webinar today. Our presenters will be really expanding and deepening our understanding of racial equity. But as a baseline, let's look at this definition. Excuse me. So we see racial equity as a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted how one fares. When we use the term, we're thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice, and thus we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestations. This includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or fail to eliminate them. And this definition comes to us from the Center of Assessment and Policy Development. We'll hear from our speakers how these different points and pieces of racial equity fit and align with farm to early care and education work. And to establish this shared understanding of what is farm to early care and education, we see farm to early care and education as a broad-ranging group of strategies and activities that increase access to healthy local food, gardening opportunities, and food and nutrition and agriculture education within these multiple types of setting, reaching children ages 0 to 5 and their families. While all farm to school and farm to early care and education elements and initiatives do look slightly different, they generally include at least one of these core elements: procurement, school gardens, and education. And we'll hear from our speakers today how each of these elements provides unique opportunities to place equity at the center of programming and policy development. For example, ensuring culturally reflective curriculum is available to ECE providers, or prioritizing purchasing from local farmers of color. So by its very nature, farm to school and farm to early care and education are at the intersection of multiple sectors, including policy, education, food systems, and social justice. And so when we talk about farm to school and farm to early care and education as a triple win, with benefiting children, benefiting farmers, and benefiting communities, this really underscores the opportunity to reach and impact these multiple sectors, arenas, and groups of people. And establish farm to school as a platform for advancing racial equity in these multiple sectors. So with farm to early care and education in particular, looking at the impacts and work with the early care and education sector, we have these multiple and compounding benefits that align with early care and education priority areas, including family and community engagement, enhanced educational experience, and health and wellness. And these areas provide us additional leverage points to affect change and advance equity within the early care and education system. So with that language and basics to get us started, I'd like to introduce our presenters who will be expanding and deepening the conversation today. Today we have Jeffrey Capizano, president of the Policy Equity Group and located in Washington, D.C. Prior to forming his consultancy, Jeff was a senior policy advisor for early childhood development and education at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Jeff and his colleagues at the Policy Equity Group are providing technical assistance to organizations working on farm to EC initiatives in 5 states: Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Next, we'll hear from Jamise Coel. She serves as a senior associate at the Food Trust, a Philadelphia-based nonprofit that works to ensure everyone has access to affordable, nutritious food and information to make healthy decisions. She leads multiple projects spanning a variety of healthy food access areas, including early childhood nutrition, farm to school, and regional food systems. Jamise is also a certified lactation counselor and serves as the co-chair for her region's Community Breastfeeding Task Force. She's an elected school board director for the William Penn School District and holds a BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Finally, we'll hear from Tess Draves. Tess has been doing community-based food systems work with the Center for Environmental Farming Systems since 2007. She's currently co-host to Food Corps North Carolina in partnership with Liz Driscoll of North Carolina 4-H. Tess founded and co-leads CEF's Food Youth Initiative in partnership with multiple statewide and local organizations, an effort to increase youth leadership in North Carolina. She's part of the core team at CEFS, working on racial equity in the food system, serves on the steering committee of the Farm to School Coalition of North Carolina, and is the state partner with the National Farm to School Network for North Carolina. So welcome to our wonderful presenters, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey Capizano to get us started.
Great, Lacey. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to try to do 3 things with my time on the webinar today. The first is to talk maybe a little bit more about the Farm to EC initiative in the 5 states that I'm working with that's funded by the Kellogg Foundation. And then take a little time to talk about the way that the Policy Equity Group thinks about equity Lacey had mentioned that, we think about it both as a lens and an outcome, and I wanted to take a little deeper dive into that conversation. And then, really look at, how to take a equity lens and use it to think about the way that policies potentially affect equity. So Lacey, if you could move to the next slide, that'd be great. So the way in which the Policy Equity Group intersects with the Farm to EC movement is through a 5-state Kellogg Initiative, where Kellogg is funding grantees within states to promote Farm to EC initiatives. And the way that it works is that they're funding clusters of grantees within states to engage in collective action around Farm to ECE. And the grantees typically include an early childhood advocacy organization, a food advocacy organization, an early childhood provider, and a food hub. And they all work together on issues related to procurement, nutrition education, family engagement, and really try to establish a proof of concept for Farm to ECE in the 5 states that Lacey mentioned: Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And we have a connection with both Tess and Jamise in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. And the overall goals of the work is to try to foster an enabling policy context for Farm to ECE, really work on promoting early childhood quality through a focus on helping early childhood programs meet their nutrition standards, particularly if they're a Head Start program, and also to help children meet early learning standards related to health and nutrition, and to promote economic development, particularly among minority farmers. And all of this is done clearly because it's a Kellogg-funded project through a racial equity lens. And so the information that I provide today is really sort of using that as sort of my grounding and my perspective. So next slide, Lacey. So I wanted to start, like the new year is really a time for reflection. And so I wanted to start by just reflecting on something an article I read last week related to the way that the United States is kind of winning the war on cancer. There's a headline that talked about sort of the cancer death rate falling by 25% from 1991 to 2014, and that translates into about 2.1 million deaths that have been averted based on better treatments and preventative care. And this is something that you really want to celebrate. But as you kind of go through the article and you continue to read, they start to break out the data by race, ethnicity, and what we're finding is Blacks had the highest cancer rate, particularly Black males had a very high cancer death rate, a much lower 5-year survival rate compared to white families or white individuals, and there were some pretty specific structural reasons why that was occurring. So, you have the uninsured rate being 11% among Blacks and 7% among whites. And even among, Blacks and whites that were both insured, the quality of care was lower for Blacks than it was for whites or Latinos. And, there was some conversation about disparities being narrowed, although not very much. And so, just kind of reflecting on that, this is really the story of equity in America. I mean, there's no other way to think about it. And I'm sorry about the sirens outside. I'm near a fire station. I can't do anything about it. But but if you think about any outcome related to early childhood education, food access, health, the story is basically the story. Blacks and Latinos don't do as well as whites. There's typically a structural reason why that's the case, and that we're making some progress, but it's not enough. And when I think about this article, what I really liked about it is that it really does take the two perspectives on equity that I always talk about. And if you can go to the next slide, Lacey. Really thinking about racial equity both sort of as a lens, it's like a way of seeing the world, like how would you go about sort of thinking about different problems, and as an outcome, like we have organized our society in a specific way, and here are the results of that, and really thinking about that as an outcome, and this is sort of the the world in which we live. Next slide, Lacey. So when we think about sort of racial equity as a lens, we're thinking about it as a proactive framework for examining and addressing issues of structural racism in systems and organizations. And So there's a lot that goes into that. And, if you think about sort of how do you want to approach looking, sort of using racial equity as a lens, I think the first thing you really need to do is start by kind of understanding sort of your own implicit bias. Like, do we understand our own sort of unconscious biases that develop over time, and sort of how do we combat those to see the world in a purely objective way with relation to equity? You have to kind of understand the historical foundations related to why we're seeing the results that we're seeing, and I know Tess will talk a little bit more about that in her presentation. And also sort of what are the current structures that are in place, the policy structures, the institutional structures that are causing these inequities. And so that's, when you think about racial equity as a lens, you're kind of incorporating all of these different pieces. And, through the work that we're doing in the 5 states, you see racial equity being used as a lens in farm to EC in a number of different ways. I think one of the ways, and I think Jamise might talk a little bit about this, is, in the way that the states and the grantees within the states are approaching stakeholder engagement. So when you're thinking about sort of a task force that you might put together at the state level for farm to ECE that you want to ultimately become sort of a vehicle for advocacy, how are you making sure that task force is incorporating all the diverse perspectives within the state, both geographically, in terms of race, in terms of income, and getting all of the perspectives and making sure that you're treating all of the perspectives equally. It's also about choosing the types of early childhood providers in which to partner. Typically, those who are most in need of farm to EC initiatives are the ones that will have the most trouble implementing. And so, how do you go about finding those most disadvantaged programs and working with them, even though implementation will be difficult? It's also about going out and finding those and identifying and working with those minority farmers, and about, as like you said, kind of engaging in culturally sensitive practices in terms of food access, in terms of pedagogy within the program, and in terms of your family engagement initiatives around using the local gardens. And there's really no separation between food and culture. And so when you're working on giving access to locally sourced foods, you have to do it in culturally sensitive ways. And this is kind of, the ways that, we're always looking at the work that we're doing through this racial equity lens. Next slide, please. So the other way you think about equity is as an outcome, and that was pretty clear in the cancer study, where they were really focused very much on the differential outcomes, and it kind of goes back to Lacey's sort of initial definition, where equity means that race, gender, immigrant status, disability, geography, none of those things are predictive of experiences or outcomes for kids. And clearly that's not the case, because, in the cancer study, for example, you can predict that, blacks were 15% more likely than whites to get cancer and not survive. And so, that is a predictive statistic, unfortunately. And, when you think about equity as an outcome and focus on it that way, I think the key is really about the disaggregation of data to show the disparities. Averages mask variation, so the thing that you need to do is really focus on the disaggregation. And I think, within the farm to ECE movement, we're still kind of struggling with that, because I think, we want to know that in early childhood programs that there are no differences in the healthy foods that children are getting by race. And most of what we know around that is really anecdotal, and we know that it most likely varies significantly by the type of program setting. So you would think that Head Start, given its program performance standards, would probably do a better job providing access to healthy foods than non-Head Start programs. CACF programs, given their rules, would do better than non-CACF programs. And we do have data that exists that's good on obesity rates, food deserts, and ECE quality, but we don't have that same sort of data for food access in early childhood programs by race. And I think there have been studies using the Healthy Eating Index to look at the types of foods that children are eating in childcare programs, but nothing that's really been broken out to be able to really show the inequities. And you are what you measure, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we really need that data. And I think we're still working on, clearly defining the outcomes of the farm to EC practices and measuring those disparities in those outcomes. But I think, when Tess and Jimmy talk about their work, I think, they're the farthest along in that area. All right, next slide, Lacey. So what I want to do just for a few more minutes is just to talk about, taking this notion of racial equity as a lens and using it within the context of evaluating policy. Equity can really be used as a lens or a framework by which to evaluate policy, particularly in the way that policies might impact early childhood experiences and really promote or support equitable outcomes. I think the key to really thinking about equity as it relates to policy is to begin to understand the different dimensions of policy. Typically, policies have a number of different components, and at least if you go to the next slide. So essentially, when you think about deconstructing a policy, it really consists of a number of different components. I have 5 here. So when you think about a policy in relation to sort of farm to ECE, for example, the question is always about who's in charge of the policy, who gets to administer it. Is it the Department of Health and Human Services, is it the Department of Education? Who gets access to the policy? Who's eligible? What are the program standards that are related to the policy? So if you're a program that is subject to the policy, what are the things that you have to do to be in compliance? And what implementation support? So given the fact that you have to do certain things to comply, what are the sources of support, technical assistance and other coaching that are provided in order to help you comply? And then how are you held accountable? So you might have strong program standards related to a policy that promote equity, but if there's no monitoring, no accountability, then it kind of renders those program standards useless. And so when you think about equity as it relates to policy and kind of evaluating policy from an equity lens, you really need to think about these different areas of policy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through them pretty quickly. So in terms of administration, one of the things you think about is what organization or authority has authority over the program and what implications does this have for equity? So is it the Department of Education, Human Services, as I said, is it a state or is it a locality? Is it a school or is it a community based organization? And, one of the clearest examples of, the importance of administration and promoting equity goes back to sort of the founding of Head Start, where, there was a very conscious decision to make Head Start a federal to local program to be able to circumvent some of the states during the 1960s, particularly in the South, that the administration felt wouldn't be implementing it with fidelity and actually using it for its intended purposes of supporting sort of poor children in those states. And, every once in a while, the debate sort of kind of circles back around when they talk about sort of block branding Head Start or giving it to the Department of Education. I just included a quote from Sarah Green, where she says, it would be a contradiction in the purpose to have a program designed to fight the disadvantages of poverty in the educational system and turn management of that program to those who systemize inequality. So here's kind of an example of where, the administration of the program has implications or perceived implications for equity. Next slide. So the next element, this notion of eligibility and barriers to entry is very kind of intuitive, right? Who does or does not have access to the program or service, and how do the eligibility rules work? How well is it communicated? Where the social service is located? And I think, when we think about our work in Farm to ECE, I think outreach is such a big part of what we're doing, really trying to sort of support, whoever we need to try to get out into those communities and get to those programs that serve the most disadvantaged children and to try to serve them with these initiatives. And the quote here talks about sort of a specific example within a report from HHS about the notion of immigrant status and how it might not just be about eligibility specifically, but the fact that someone might be eligible, but there might be other barriers to entry, such as language or distance needed to be traveled to apply. And so those are the things that can also sort of be barriers to promoting equity in policy, particularly around eligibility. Next slide, please. So I think one of the more important elements of policy that impact equity has to do with the program standards related to the policy. So if you're an early childhood program and, what are the rules or regulations of operating a program that is fair to all children who access the program. And if you look at sort of the new Head Start program performance standards, you see, a real push to sort of promote nutrition for all children in the program, and so those standards mean a lot to supporting access to healthy food for poor kids. And if you think about programs like the CACFP program, for example, it's a great program, but it's very burdensome. It has very burdensome requirements, right? You have issues related to, procurement, to meeting the meal patterns, to providing the documentation, that you're complying. These can be barriers to entry for the program, and you see the take-up rates, not what they could be for CACFP because of these program standards, and that's something that disproportionately impacts minority children. The fact that we're not making this program easier, so that's kind of one example of program standards playing a role in equity around PharmTEC related work, and I include a quote here that talks about suspensions and expulsions in early childhood, which is kind of the key racial equity issue in early childhood, where you have Blacks being 8% of the enrollment and 48% of those expelled, and how you work to change the program standards, particularly in Head Start, where they have limited the ability for programs to do suspension and expulsions for that reason. Next slide. And then sort of another component to sort of policy, promoting equity in policy has to do with implementation support, and to the extent that training and technical assistance is available for successful policy implementation. And if you think about what we're doing in PharmTEC, I think a lot of the policy related work in PharmTEC is really part of this implementation support area, where you see Lacey's work doing the alignment with the Head Start program performance standards and showing how PharmTEC initiatives can support compliance to certain Head Start standards, and we see alignment with child care licensing requirements and how different elements of PharmTEC training and initiatives support programs in meeting TQRIS standards and things like that. So there's a sort of an implementation support component to the PharmTEC work. And I pulled a quote which I thought was fascinating from the National Association of Social Workers, where they were talking about, we talk about these policies and we talk about implementation support, but there's not a single profession in the United States that requires its professionals to demonstrate an understanding of structural racism. And so, this is not something that has been infused into the implementation support around any of our policies. We can do better on that. And then just the last sort of area in promoting equity in policy has to do with accountability. So if you have sort of strong standards and you're not monitoring on those standards, it doesn't create the incentive to actually comply. So you have to ask, how are programs and organizations and staff being held accountable or rewarded for what they do? And I think in the PharmTEC movement, we're just starting to see kind of indicators in the TQRIS systems around PharmTEC, and that's not a great example of sort of accountability, but we do start to see some incentivizing of this within these state systems. And I just wanted to conclude just kind of really quickly with kind of a thought from someone who's taught me a lot about racial equity, Dr. Rosemary Allen of the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence, where she talks about, she uses this great quote from Glenn Harris, when a system is out of balance, people of color feel the impacts most acutely, but to be clear, an imbalanced system makes us all pay. And so, as we continue our work, it's really about not just, Black and brown children and families, it's about everyone. And so I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and hand it back to Lacey.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was such a full of information. I know that all of us working within early care and education and food systems really recognize how influential policy is in our work. And so it's fantastic to have those tools to look at it through the equity lens. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jamise to continue our conversations. If you do have questions for Jeff around policy and farm to ECE, please enter those into the question box, and we'll have a continued conversation after our presenters. Jamise, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my honor to be joining you all today, and thank you to Lacey and the National Farm to School Network for the invitation to share our work. My name is, pardon me. My name is Jamise Quelle, and I serve as Senior Associate on the Community Food Systems team at the Food Trust. And the Food Trust is a nonprofit. We're based in Philadelphia. We were founded 25 years ago, and our mission is to work to ensure that everyone has access to nutritious, affordable food and information to make healthy decisions. So to begin, I would really like to just set the context and give you some background information on our Farm to ECE work. So the Food Trust has been doing work at the intersection of early childhood and nutrition for well over a decade. And in recent years, we began to really build up this work through our Ready, Set, Grow Farm to ECE program. And through Ready, Set, Grow, we support on-the-ground Farm to ECE programming, working in partnership with childcare and early learning providers locally in the Philadelphia area, as well as in southern New Jersey. And Ready, Set, Grow works to build capacity within early care and education providers using a train-the-trainer approach, which combines training, technical assistance, and mini grants to help early childhood programs build and grow their farm to ECE practices. And in 2016, with generous support from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Food Trust began working in partnership with the Pennsylvania Head Start Association and Norris Square Community Alliance to advance statewide support for Farm to ECE in Pennsylvania. And our statewide work really seeks to increase public understanding and support for Farm to ECE, build state agency capacity to support Farm to ECE, and lay the foundation for statewide Farm to ECE policy change. We recently launched a new website for our statewide Farm to ECE work, and we encourage you to visit. It's pareadysetgrow.org. You can learn more about our initiative, check out our equity resource page, and sign up for our newsletter. Lacey, do I have control still?
You do. It looks like we have, okay, try that one more time. Had a little glitch there. Okay, I'm gonna move you on to the next slide. There you go, but you should have control from now on.
Just to give you a sense of how we got started, we really just got started with our equity work about a year ago in late 2016. My colleague, Kari Draves, attended Facing Race in Atlanta, which is a national conference. And he brought back an analysis that really helped us realize that we needed to redefine our focus and bring race from the periphery to the center of our statewide Farm to ECE work. So we decided that we needed to really better understand what equity was, and we needed a tool to help us build equity into our work. So we decided to develop a racial equity framework. And while we've worked on the framework over the past year, we've done a lot of research. We've looked at other models. We attended conferences. We spoke to folks who've had experience with this type of work. We got technical assistance from the Policy Equity Group. And we've really been just testing different strategies to build in equity and examining the results and tweaking our approach along the way. Next slide. So we're on this journey towards ensuring that everything we do is implemented with a racial equity lens. And we want to share, both where we are, but also how we got here in hopes of supporting others who are looking to start their journey or who are looking for tips on the way. So here's a quick map of our journey, past and present and future. Next slide. And this image really represents the reality of our equity journey. So I'd really like to make it clear that this process has not been clean or simple. It's not been linear. It's had tons of challenges, and it is certainly an iterative process that we are very much still working through and learning as we go. Next slide. So what do we mean by equity? And we've all, we've heard a little bit about this. And equity has been referred to both as a process and an outcome. I like this quote from Yannick Redwood, who refers to equity, quote, as an outcome whereby you can't tell the difference in health or life expectancy by race, but also a process whereby we explicitly value people of color and low-income communities to achieve the outcome we seek. So for us, it really is the lens that we use and the outcomes that we seek, and we think both are important and they are actually intimately related. Next slide. Okay, so why racial equity? Why are we focusing on equity? We're leading with race because of the central role that it has occupied in patterns of structural marginalization. From the very beginning of our country being founded, our society and its institutions of power, be they economic, social, political, they were built on racism and patriarchy. And race is really at the core of structural marginalization. So even, structures and systems today that we see that may appear to be race neutral or colorblind, in reality, they still distribute resources and benefits and burdens in ways that produce and reproduce racialized outcomes. And we really need to recognize this. We need to talk about race, and we need to do it directly and deeply. And so for us, this is about being race explicit, which means naming, framing, and operating with a racial equity lens in order to achieve positive outcomes for all. I do want to mention that our focus on race is explicit, but it's not exclusive. We absolutely acknowledge the deep interconnections and complex interactions between multiple and intersecting forms of oppression. So racism, sexism, classism, xenophobia, heteronormativity, ableism, and more. And for us, racial equity is really a point of departure, and we don't stop there. Next slide. So reframing our work through an equity lens really changes the way that we look at farm to ECE, at food systems, early childhood, disparities, inequities, their root causes, and potential solutions. It really transforms the way that we approach our work, so that we're laser focused on universal goals and targeted strategies. We believe that the racial equity lens is what gets us on the right path to do the long-term work that will bring about just and fair inclusion for all. And we do it this way not only because it's the right thing to do, because it is, we do it this way because it works. Next slide. So we'd like to share this concept of targeted universalism, which is really central to our efforts. Targeted universalism is really all about recognizing racial inequities and acknowledging their existence within a larger institutional framework. So we set universal goals for all while paying particular attention to the specific context and situation of marginalized groups. Next slide. We have a universal goal for all children for farm to ECE, which you can see here. And in seeking to bring that about, we need to develop targeted strategies to ensure that specific groups do not get left behind. And the idea here is to be more inclusive and strategic in our work. And this is really important, and Jeff alluded to this. So although we appear to be separated by our different spaces and identities and experiences, we all share a linked fate. Systems that fail some of us fail all of us. And problems that are byproducts of this failure hurt people of color first and hardest, but make no doubt they hurt all of us. So leading with race is the best way to achieve better results for a society as a whole. Next. So now that I've talked about our lens and the context for our approach, I would like to talk about our framework and the process for developing it and applying it. And I do want to mention that we developed a framework, a racial equity framework, to create something that will be enduring and can be carried on. And it's really about policies and practices and structures that we're setting up to be systemic and enduring and operate no matter who is at the helm. Next. So the ultimate question is, how do we design our work in such a way that equity is built in? We want our work to reflect our values. And so it's really important to think about the anchor points in our work and where we can embed equity every step along the way. It's about a mindset that should come into play at every decision point in our work. Next slide. So to give you a little sense of some initial strategies that we use to build in equity into our work, our statewide farm to EC work began about 18 months ago. And 6 months into the process, about a year ago, we recognized that we were missing that equity piece. And at that point, many of our strategies for the project and structures for stakeholder engagement had already been decided and were in progress. And so we worked to sort of build in equity into what we already had. And so here's what we did. And this graphic sort of lays that out. We worked to make our task force more diverse. We created an equity committee as a part of the task force. We developed a Harvest of the Month curriculum and then made sure to translate it into Spanish. We presented on an equity webinar hosted by the Policy Equity Group. And we also compiled a list of about 100 books with farm to ECE themes that feature racially and ethnically diverse characters so that children of color learning about farming and agriculture and healthy foods would see themselves reflected in the book. And then for our second round of Farm to ECE Champion Awards, which is a program that we set up to recognize providers who are doing Farm to ECE across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. To get the word out about that award opportunity, we created an outreach plan to get the word out to folks across the state with a special focus on communities of color. We formed a diverse selection committee who used a rubric to award additional points to applications from providers who serve lower income children and their families, for providers who use culturally relevant practices and family engagement strategies. And then lastly, we launched our website, and on it we communicated our racial equity focus is one of our aims, and we have a whole page of equity resources. And we also included equity resources on all of our resource pages that have been developed for different groups of stakeholders. Next slide. And so we did all of those things in just 1 year. It was really great to sort of reflect on that with the team. And looking back, and reflecting on that, each of our strategies was really a reflection of our understanding at the time, and I would say sort of like where we were in the process. And one thing that we've really learned is when you do this work, you start where you are and with what you have. And a lot of times when we begin this equity work, we start with diversity and inclusion, which are certainly important parts of equity. And as we're getting further along in the process and we're learning more and we're sharpening our analysis, I would say that we're really pushing ourselves further, and we're getting to a place where we can actually begin to examine where and how our work is disrupting and shifting power, particularly racialized power. Next slide. So I would say now we're thinking not just about adding equity to our work as like this separate piece. We're doing everything that we're doing and then we're doing the equity piece on the side, but really transforming all of our work to get to equity. And so as a part of our equity framework, we developed 2 tools to support transformational change in our work. One is our racial equity strategy questions and our racial equity goals. So our racial equity goals state what we value and what we will do. And the questions ask, how are we going to do it and what structures, processes, and activities will support getting it right, as well as support accountability. Next slide. So I did include 2 examples here. They don't actually directly relate to one another, but just to give you a sense of what I'm referring to in terms of our racial equity strategy questions and our racial equity goals. And in terms of process, it was actually the questions that came first and the questions that were developed, and then out of those, the goals were created. Next slide. And so I sort of want to just give you a sense of how this plays out and how, when you use this racial equity lens, how it shifts your way of thinking, and then that in turn shifts the way that you do things. So again, as I said before, it's not just about adding equity to our work as an added piece, but getting to a place where we're transforming our work to get to equity. So particularly around this piece with, stakeholder engagement, it's really about designing our work to facilitate racially equitable participation, building in participant ownership from the beginning at every stage, and making equity an imperative and integrated into every aspect from the onset. Next slide. And I also want to just talk really briefly about this culturally relevant piece that we've been incorporating into Farm to EC, which is really, really important. So we have, it's both necessary and important work of ensuring that we're promoting cultural relevancy in local foods procurement, in gardening, and through hands-on educational activities. And what I want to make sure that we're doing as Farm to EC practitioners and advocates is thinking about how we can incorporate that power analysis, okay? So I think, how we're going to get there is by examining the why behind the cultural relevancy piece so that we can find the language and the practices to move forward with intentionality together. And really taking these ideas around cultural relevancy and extending them further, really digging in to better understand culturally relevant pedagogies and the implications for our work. And I just want to put it out there to folks, if you're interested in doing this and working on this with us, please get in touch so that we can think about it together. Next slide. And so just to share some of our overall lessons learned, I would say the most meaningful part of all of this has not just been the product, which is our racial equity framework. It's really been the process and the journey and all the different things that we've learned along the way. And we're really honored today to have had the opportunity to share some of that journey with you and some of the things that we've learned. I would say, that just the importance of humility has become very clear. It's sort of like peeling back the layers of the onion, and you think you get it, and then you peel back another layer and you realize, wow, I really just need to develop a deeper level of understanding around all of this. And so I would encourage folks as you're on your journey to really be okay with the state of not knowing. It's really important that we hold ourselves and one another with trust and compassionate accountability on this journey. And having faith that we really can learn and we can change and we can grow both individually and collectively, and we can work together to bring about structural and institutional change. The equity journey is a journey without an endpoint, and it's about the process and transformation for a more just and inclusive world. Next slide. So I would like to leave you with this quote: "Those who practice leadership for equity must confront, disappoint, and dismantle, and at the same time energize, inspire, and empower." Next slide. So thank you for your time, and we would really love to hear from you. So please get in touch, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Jamise. It's really fantastic to see your journey and really great words for folks starting in on their own journey. I know that many people are hesitant to jump into this conversation around racial equity for fear of offending or being wrong. And I appreciate your words to empower people to help have that conversation. Finally, I'd like to turn it over to our final presenter, Tess Draves from the Center for Environmental Farming System. Tess, I'm going to turn mouse control over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And I really appreciate both Jeff and Jamise endlessly for the work that they're doing, and am endlessly inspired. I am going to try and speak quickly so we can get to questions, because I know folks will have a lot. I really appreciate you hanging in these afternoon hours. I wanted to share that CEFS is a partnership between our land grant universities in North Carolina, the 1862 and the 1890s from the Morrill Act. If you aren't familiar with that history, go check it out. It's a great starting point. What's really important there is that we're part of the state system. And so we're doing sustainable ag research coming from the food system side, and also in our food systems programming, doing racial equity work. And we've got food systems programming in a number of areas. My particular work has been in our youth-focused work. Whoops. We're going crazy. Can you help?
Let me get you back to the start. Okay.
It wants me to finish quickly too. I've been at CEFS for about a decade, but and my work started with programming that was focused on racial equity from the core. Not all of our food system programs start that way, and so we've got a real mishmash across the organization of trying to bring equity to work versus work that's rooted in equity from the beginning. I put up this photo just to acknowledge Caroline Stover, who runs our ECE program. She's in the food core t-shirt in the upper right-hand corner with the kids. She started with us as a service member in food core a number of years back. And again, that's another example of food core really trying to do this farm to school work in a way that advanced equity and having inherent structures like AmeriCorps and so forth that have some barriers to that from the beginning. So maybe testifying to what Jamisa said about the enlist process and the work that's involved, and the self-compassion as well as self-persistence and accountability that's needed to jump in. So I don't know if I have control or you do, but I'll keep trying. Thanks, Lace. What I'm going to talk about today is really backing up and broadening out again a little bit back to the inequity context for the food system, and then I'll just run through really quickly the ECE program that we have here, and how we've tried to adapt this lens to that work. I won't go into quite as much detail as Jamise did, but I think you'll hear me again and again saying the same things that they have, and so I hope this is a kind of layering of sameness that helps learning and is not sheerly redundant. When we talk about an equity lens, it's really clear, again, starting with language is really important for me always. And so just for clarity, when we talk about this racial equity lens, again, we are talking about a process, like both had mentioned before, and it's really focused on these three things: acknowledging the structures that exist and analyzing the impacts, and then addressing at a structural level what change can look like. And that gets tricky because a lot of our work has direct impacts, and we're also trying to figure out what those structural shifts can really look like. I don't read from slides often, so I'll let you look through that yourself, but if we were in person, I would make you do a little dance around your chair because it's almost 4 o'clock to acknowledge that you had read those. history is really, for me, an essential starting place when trying to take this lens to our work. The U.S. history and legacy that we live with today, especially for those of us in agriculture, means that institutions have embedded structural racism, and that's the structures and policies that don't require racist individuals. And I think that that's a really key, important point. We're not talking about, even though today we may be seeing a rise of that, we're not talking about or individuals that ascribe to out and out racist practices. We're talking about structures that, just by maintaining the status quo, perpetuate these inequities. And again, knowing the history, because from the founding of our country, we've been deeply entrenched in structures that keep inequities alive and put them in place. And from really the creation of race in the beginning of our country to persistent challenges today from this legacy. And learning about these, whether or not they're part of your lived experience and family knowledge, and even if they are, provides a really painful but really necessary foundation for understanding the kind of policy breakdown that Jeff is talking about. It's this history of race construction as a legal identifier, and one where POC folks are oppressed and disadvantaged, and we talk about that a lot, but what's equally important to talk about is, again, how whites were advantaged. And this latter is important because even landmark acts that sometimes seem like they're advancing civil rights continued to advantage white people. So if you think about things as well known as Brown versus Board of Education, integration of the schools is a huge success for that movement, for the civil rights movement. But the impact of that had huge numbers of Black teachers losing their jobs as white teachers were sought to people those integrated schools. And that meant that far less experienced white teachers took the place of experienced teachers of color as schools became integrated. So when we think about how we think about these policies, for school lunch, for education, farming, entitlement programs, the Farm Bill, allocation, all of this has to be looked at through this equity lens to actually shift things and begin thinking about impact, not just intention. So when, again, like looking at racial equity specifically in ECE, when I talk about impacts, I'm really looking at the disparities in outcomes. So again, same kind of language that we've seen consistently today of racial equity being both a process and an outcome. I'm talking about assessing these disparities in health, wellness, education, economics, et cetera, and how they all correlate with race. So again, the idea that that Jamise talked about looking explicitly at race, not exclusively, but the reason that we focus on racial equity in our work is this issue of disparities. So among many other things, actually, but disparities is the easy go-to to really explain it. So in North Carolina, 1 in 4 kids is insecure, food insecure. But for kids of color, that number is 1 in 3. And this kind of disparity is what we see across the board, not just in North Carolina, but across the country. And this is the disaggregation that Jeff was talking about. And all of these, there are lots of communities that are suffering. We have plenty of poor white communities suffering in North Carolina. But if you look at the breakdown, if you look at the disparities pulled apart, there's almost always a correspondence with race. And so though there are many groups that suffer, we like to talk about it, and this is not an original quote, Jamise, it's not just ours. I think Ricardo Salvador said it, but it's not just only race, but it's always race. And this is kind of the core element that brings us again to this process plus outcome. This picture is an activity at a child care center, one of our child care centers, because really we're like in the ECE work, the farm to ECE work, we're bringing these two worlds together. ECE and food systems folks. We work a lot of our farm to school partners are also involved, and some of them have already bridged these worlds, but really two very different worlds, and bringing these things together and looking at the kind of general impacts listed on the slide, again, that I think have been referenced by other speakers. These are probably really familiar, but even if you go straight to food system sectors and look at impacts there, you can go across the food system, across food sectors, across stakeholders, and see the possibility for racial equity impacts. So in production, opening up new markets for POC farmers, and again, where all of these things take intention and a strategy like the one that Jamis has laid out to make happen. So production, processing, new business opportunities, food preparation, the same for distribution, marketing opportunities for POC farmers by exposing parents and center staff to new places and ways of purchasing. I mean, it's really kind of endless. The preparation, which again opens up opportunities for cultural relevancy, and even in waste removal, which is the final piece of the food system in this cycle, and the activity that they have in your photograph, really seeing innovative programs in everything from like ugly fruit sourcing of seconds at a lower price point for centers to composting programs at centers for gardeners. So again, across the food system, across stakeholders, where impact happens, and we can see the outcomes that reflect racial equity. And again, in terms of language, when I say racial equity, I'm talking really simply, I've loved the definition that Jamis used, but I'm talking really simply about when outcomes and opportunities are not dependent on your zip code or the color of your skin. This is the theory of change that we use as kind of the framework for a number of our projects. So again, not just our ECE work, but a number of our forums. And I'll let you read through it. It comes from a book called Collective Visioning by Linda Stout. It's adapted from that. And really kind of the way it works is that, I don't know if y'all heard that cow, that's my contradiction to Jeff's city siren, but if you didn't hear it, that made no sense. I just had a cow moo in the background. Anyway, thanks. So our work is intentionally both as an organization and through coalitions, because all of our work is collaborative. I think it's essential with racial equity work, as well as food systems work in general, but work in these 4 quadrants. So we're touching all of these things. And additionally, any given component of a program would also probably touch all 4 of these simultaneously. So again, it's like, what are the structures that you're crafting that lay out a design which will itself drive the racial equity? The project itself, and I've got 3 slides here to end up in, so I'll close in a couple minutes. You'll see they're really redundant. The slides are broken up in project or program design and development, implementation, and evaluation. But the core of starting our program was to overlay on existing successes that were focused in these directions. So relationships with organizations in the state like Smart Start, Shape and See, and another initiative around ECE, cooperative extension efforts, and again, some of the work that had been happening in relationships building and farm to school already. But the design is really to take these major stakeholders and create these local teams, so that everything really at the heart of it is about this local capacity building. And these the structure of the program focuses on these teams. There's also a structure for affinity groups, so that folks within that team of a certain identity have an opportunity to connect and share learned lessons and challenges as well. So like there's a parents call. Parents and farmers and staff are at the table of those center teams, in addition to the center owner, director, and organization leads, et cetera. And then we have these learning sessions where we've brought everybody together from across the state for these things. And what's really important there is that the needs for those meetings, what folks wanted to focus on, was really determined by the teams themselves. So it wasn't us driving that. It was our local teams driving that. And then the racial equity trainings, which we did regionally across the state. And again, those trainings are really just a starting point for a conversation. And that's really, oh, I went too forward again. That's really an essential point, because trainings themselves just give you the tools to begin the work. And so the program implementation is really just the enactment of these tools and of the language that we've shared, of the practices that people are working on, and the mechanisms within that to continually revise and address the challenges that are coming up and make them work in a way that works for them. So there are lots of, there are endless numbers of creative ventures that we've seen. All of our sites come up with different ones. Jimmy's named so many beautiful ones. These photos are examples of, we had a farmer who did a drop-off for a CSA as part of the center's changing of their snack plan and their meal plan, but they set up a CSA pickup for their parents at the same time, so it economically assisted the farmer both through marketing and actual income, in addition to just sourcing for the center. The other photo is one of our centers had pickup at the farmer's market. So the kids not only walk to the farmer's market and get that education and have a fun activity, but the parents go too. And that's, again, just an example. We have literacy boxes that we put together that put people of color, children, identity at the center of that kind of curricular education. So they've got hand puppets with kids of color, and again, literature boxes, literary resources, both books and tools for activities around literacy, et cetera. So again, just repeatedly hitting these components of the theory of change. And then again, I won't speak here, I'll close up, but evaluation, the same kind of thing, heading towards these measures that Jeff was talking about is, what does it really look like? And we've got some, in our evaluator was part of our equity trainings, a participant of our equity trainings, not an observant of that. So we do some things that are kind of unusual. And again, it's just part of our practice of really capacity building for everyone, because most of our programming is time driven, it's grant funded. And so what we're really looking at in this theory of change by hitting all these quadrants is really believing that we can shift things long term so that things become a practice by all the participants and are interdependent of the original source of that thing. So things are really shifting, and that we're looking at a long-term process and ascribing to equity principles that will go on in the way things are done and the way things are assessed and the way things are crafted moving forward into new programming. So again, I want to thank you all. I'm really grateful to continue this shared learning. I look forward to the questions, and I just want to echo everything Jimmy said about entering this process. It requires a huge amount of humility and long-term commitment and compassion for yourself and for others, and accountability. And I'm grateful to be here on that front. So, Lacey, I will turn it over to you for what we can scavenge for question time.
Thank you so much, Tess. It's fantastic to hear about your work in North Carolina, and we really appreciate you creating that historical context for us, and how vital it is to acknowledge and understand that historical context as we all work together to move forward. We do have about 5 minutes for questions. We'll be following up and sharing our presenters' contact information, so if we don't get to your question, you will have the chance to follow up. So let's get started with questions. As you do have questions, please put those in the in the question box, and we'll address as many as we can. Our first question is for Jamise. We have a number of people interested in seeing the book list. Is that something you'd be able to share with us and we could send out to the audience?
Absolutely. We have it very much in draft form. We're looking forward to getting it up on our website. But if folks just want the list, we're happy to send that along.
Great. Yeah, if you want to forward that to me, we'll be sure to send that out with a follow-up email. I know a lot of people are really interested in that. Our next question is for Jeff. Jeff, I'm wondering if you could expand on how practitioners, early care education practitioners or early care education providers can be active in advocating for policy changes at the state or other levels that can create more equitable policies. How can folks working more at the programmatic level really engage in that active policy action?
Sure, I think that's a great question. I think, one of the things that we work on quite a bit is this notion of like practice-informed policy. So I think, the first thing that you have to understand as a practitioner is that your opinion to a policymaker is the most important one because you're the one who is on the ground implementing the policy. I think one of the easiest ways to go forward is really to work through your associations. I think, if you're a Head Start program, like the National Head Start Association, the State Head Start Association are really great vehicles to sort of have your voice heard. If you're a child care provider, there's Child Care Aware, there's, state child care associations. But I think, in terms of connecting to policymakers, both at the state and at the federal level, it's probably best to try to sort of work through some advocacy groups that are already sort of aligned with what you're trying to do.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Okay.
All right, our next question is for Jamise. Jamise, can you give some more examples or clarify what you mean by the transformative mindset? Not about adding equity to the work, but changing the work to facilitate equity. Could you expand on that a bit more?
Well, what I mean is that, the way in which we do our work and the activities that we do and the structures that we build, the processes sort of feed into the results that we get. And so how you set up your structures will impact sort of what you get. Does that make sense? I tried to sort of outline that in the slides. The way that you think about the work will impact the way that you do the work. And so I can just give a very specific example of our task force. It was a statewide task force, and Pennsylvania is huge. And we were bringing people to sort of a central part of the state. And in order to get there, some people had to drive 4 or 5 hours. So that in itself created a barrier for people. We were only getting people to come who, for the most part, were paid to be there, like state agency staff, members of, early childhood associations, sort of like your grass tops people, but not the people who are doing the work on the ground because, if you're a ECU cook, you can't leave your program. If you're a parent, you can't get off of work and come to a statewide meeting. So thinking about the structures that you're using or the activities that you're creating and how they either create barriers or support participation.
Great, thanks, Jamise. That's really helpful. And one final question. I believe this is for Tess. Could you share again the name of the book and the author that your framework or your model is based from?
Sure, it's Collective Visioning by Linda Stout, and it's a great book generally for doing community-based work. And I just wanted to add on to Jamise's last point. That's a great, one of her foundations was also funding and the thing. So where one component of how you do your work can mitigate structure problems in another is a constant juggle that we're trying to do. So again, paying for folks to come in when we have a statewide meeting and need cooks and staff to be there too. And they've been very receptive to figuring out creative ways to address those kind of things.
Great. Thank you so much, Tess. And we are at the end of our hour and 15-minute session, and want to give a huge thank you to our presenters. I do hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation for us as a farm to early care and education movement, and as the National Farm to School Network prioritizes equity and racial equity within our work, that we can help facilitate these continued conversations. As I mentioned, there will be a follow-up email with additional resources as well as contact information for these presenters. And I encourage you to check out both the websites and resources from our presenters as well as those of the National Farm to School Network to learn more about farm to early care and education and racial equity. So a huge thank you to all of you. Have a great day, and we look forward to connecting with you all in the future.